Paris. Tourists come from all over the world to visit this city, to admire the monuments, to take a trip back in time, and to discover the delights of French cuisine. Behind the sumptuous decor of the Place Vendôme lies one of the most highly reputed addresses of French cuisine. Every morning, several dozen oysters are delivered here in the heart of Paris with the utmost care. Back in the kitchen, the chef is about to work wonders with a briny shellfish that is synonymous with festivity and refinement. The oyster, mysterious gift of nature.
Joel didn't forget our order.
No, they're superb. They just arrived.
The first thing that springs to mind when you see an oyster is that it's already a gift of nature, nicely packaged. An oyster is a little box, plus it fits right into your hand. Ever since the dawn of time, people must have taken this into their hand, opened it, then you notice it's tangy in the mouth. It has a distinctive flavor. It's a stimulant. It brings out other flavors. For me, an oyster is evocative. You can't just look at an oyster without wondering. You want to go, knock, knock, who's in there?
Oysters first appeared on our planet 200 million years ago. People have been gathering them since prehistoric times, and fossil traces prove that mankind has used them as a source of food since the Neolithic Age. The ancient Romans would trade them across Europe, but even before them, the Greeks thought that oysters possessed aphrodisiac powers, as well as various other qualities. At first, there was only one species in all of Europe, the flat oyster, Ostrea edulis, which came close to going extinct.
The term ostracism comes from the flat oyster. At the time, to banish a person who got out of line, the villagers would vote on a small flat oyster shell. So the term ostracism comes from the oyster Ostrea edulis.
Stéphane Pouvreau is a marine biologist and one of the foremost specialists on oysters and their mysteries.
The flat oyster, in particular, has inhabited the European coasts since the dawn of time. For a long time, it was traded by the Romans. They established oyster routes to transport the flat oyster from the French coast to Rome. We have less information about the Middle Ages, whereas during the Renaissance, we know that the king's table couldn't get enough oysters with their various benefits. A thriving commerce arose to bring an ever-growing quantity of oysters to Paris.
This painting from 1735 by Jean-François de Troyes depicts a luncheon of oysters and champagne. The association of sparkling wine and the shellfish highlights the festive aspect of the scene, which seems to delight both the aristocrats and the servants. It's a historical fact that Louis XIV was an unconditional oyster lover. The steward at the king's court, the famous Vatel, would organize extravagant feasts where the guests would devour vast quantities of fish and shellfish. At the Château of Chantilly, the king's favorite chef had to feed 3,000 guests during festivities lasting 3 days. But the fish and oysters didn't get there on time. For the chef, this was such a dishonor that he took his own life in one of the bedrooms of the Chantilly Chateau. In the 17th and 18th centuries, oysters were in fashion among upper-class tables, so much so that the natural oyster beds were over-harvested and depleted.
We don't know what the oyster beds at the bottom of the English Channel looked like at the time. We have no images from back then. We can imagine that the bed of the channel was covered with forests of vegetation full of habitats for marine life. So we try to keep in mind this image of forests of flat oysters covering the channel bed.
In the mid-19th century, Victor Coste, a member of the Academy of Sciences, believed that oysters, which up until that time had been gathered wild from the open sea, could be raised artificially, if one could unlock their mysteries. For several years, Victor Coste traveled the French coastlines and developed a technique that led to the founding of modern oyster farming. In 1863, beneath the dome of the Institut de France, on the Quai de Conti in Paris, the academician presented his preliminary findings to his peers.
Victor Coste was very important for oyster farming. He gathered information from far and wide. He observed different techniques to improve spat collection. That is, the art of getting young oysters in their natural habitat to settle onto fixed structures. When oysters reproduce, they lay their eggs, and the hatchet larvae swim freely in the water for 2 to 3 weeks before attaching themselves onto a solid support. Victor Coste optimized the techniques for capturing these young oysters, the spat. He was assisted by Ferdinand de Bon, so those two were the founding fathers of modern oyster farming.
A few years later, in recognition of his work, Victor Coste was named president of the Academy of Sciences. But at the same time, the misadventures of a merchant ship would wreak havoc on the marine ecosystem of a stretch of the French coast.
The demand for oysters was so great that they imported another oyster, the Portuguese oyster. In 1863, the Morlaisien, a ship transporting Portuguese cupped oysters, ran aground during a storm. The crew tried to save the ship by throwing the cargo of oysters overboard. Those oysters then took root and reproduced. Thus, a new species was introduced in France, the Portuguese oyster. It took hold in the Gironde in the southwest, then in the Arcachon bassin, in Marennes d'Oléron. This was between 1870 and 1888. By 1910 to 1920, the Portuguese oyster had invaded this whole part of the Atlantic coast. It was raised here in Brittany, along with the flat oyster. So in the early 20th century, you had these two species being raised at the same time.
The estuary of the Charente River and the waters around Ile Madame are a maternity ward and nursery for oysters, an ideal spot to lay their eggs in summer when the water warms up. This is the beginning of the oyster farming cycle. The first stage is collecting millions of microscopic larvae. The oyster farmers give the young oysters, the spat, collectors where they can attach themselves as they would naturally to rocks.
The larvae will drift around in the currents for about 3 weeks. The temperature has to be between 20 and 22 degrees Celsius. That's ideal. So, for 3 weeks, the larvae drift like plankton. Then, after 3 weeks, they begin to sink and develop a shell and search for a support to settle on. And what we give them is this type of collector. Ostréculture means oyster farming. We collect the larvae, the seed oysters. Like a farmer will produce his own wheat seeds. Then we raise them for 3 years. We're also fishermen because we get what nature gives us. We harvest what nature is willing to give us.
Capturing wild oysters in their natural habitat is well suited for small oyster farms. But when it comes to large-scale production, the oyster farmers buy their spat from hatcheries. In France, these companies specialized in the selection and reproduction of oysters were created in the 2000s. They produce genetically modified oysters, a sterile oyster, never milky, edible year-round. It goes by the name of triploid oyster. The Bay of Morlaix in Brittany is known for its beauty and its history. It's also the most important oyster farming zone of the Finistère region. They've been raising oysters here since 1892. Here, sheltered from the storms and the waves that buffet the Finistère coast, a dozen oyster farms turn out over 6,000 tons of cupped oysters a year.
These are first rate. They're really regular.
These young oysters are only a few weeks old. They just finished a trip of several hundred kilometers from the hatchery where they were born to the bay here where they'll grow. They're very fragile. When each delivery comes in, they carefully check the quality and number of spat.
In each of the lots we received this morning, there are about 5,000 spat per kilo. We take 2 or 3 samples of 25 or 50 grams from each crate to get an average to see if it tallies. It usually comes out about right. We have some time, so we'll take 1 or 2 more samples.
The oysters will grow in mesh bags. Then they'll be placed directly on the sand bottom if the oyster beds are protected from the waves and the swell.
Regarde un petit peu. Hop.
We'll lose at least half of these. At least. Because it's too hot or too cold. It's the wrong time, the wrong place. You can never tell, not until you do the final harvest. You really have to have the right environment and the terroir. You can't make bouillon or black pearls just anywhere. It's like the wine Romanée Conti. You have to make it where it should be made. You have to put in the work, but you also need the terroir.
During the strong tides, the oysters are regularly turned over, moved, and cleaned so that they grow in optimum conditions. They'll be cultivated for 3 to 4 years. This morning, millions of these oysters are going to be released into the Bay of Morlaix. They're going back to their natural habitat. To feed, an oyster will filter 6 liters of seawater a day. And it's the suspended nutrients that give it its taste, like the soil for a wine.
This is where it all begins. We buy the spat and we raise them here for 3 years, 4 years for the spéciales. It all happens here. The selection, the growing, the shape, all that work is done here. It's always different. Sometimes they'll grow very quickly, sometimes much slower. Then suddenly we decide we'll change their bags in 6 months, but then we have to change them in 3 months or 9 months. There are many factors involved that are beyond our control.
Instead of the soil, it's seawater it grows in. But you have the same forces at work, which completely permeate the product, like in grapevines. You have nuances with the same variety, of the same age, with the same time of refinement. Within a few meters, you can have a product that has a totally different flavor, because the oyster feeds on all elements, on plankton, that's different according to the current, and the spot it flows through.
Here we've got all the makings of a royale.
One of the chef's signature dishes at the Carré des Feuillants calls for oysters from the Arcachon Basin.
So we're using lightly poached oysters for this recipe. We'll break them down, add a touch of caviar, and then cook it like a flan. This is what we call a royale. We're going to use water from the oysters. It's wonderful. Oyster water makes for a very homogeneous, frothy mixture. We pour it out so it forms a gelatin that is crunchy, yet will melt in your mouth. We cut it into small cubes. We don't grind it up, so that we still have little bits of oyster. The pleasure shouldn't be only partial, it has to be well balanced. It's not only a food, it's also a condiment. This is very important. I think it's part of our traditional values here in good old Southern Europe. It is part of the high-quality set of gastronomical norms that we have cultivated. Now, these norms include salty, sweet, tart, and bitter, and the oyster is all of these. An oyster is more than just salty, it brings out a marine tang among many other qualities.
Life in the Gulf of Morbihan follows the rhythm of the tides. The renewal of the water in this inland sea is good for the oysters.
We're a little bit early, but it's better. It'll be easier. Sometimes when there's current, it can be a bit tricky here.
The nutrient-rich waters of the Gulf of Morbihan bring the mollusks to maturity. The maturation is another stage of oyster farming. It brings out the fleshy texture, the flavor of the oyster, and heightens the color of the flesh.
Our profession is really midway between farming and fishing. That is, like farmers, we reap what we sow, but like fishermen, we depend largely on the biotope. We don't feed oysters, we don't treat them. It's all 100% natural. I've found that it's a good mixture of the two activities I'm very fond of, fishing, which I'm somewhat familiar with, and farming, which is more my family's activity. They call us the farmers of the sea. I think that's a pretty good image. These racks we erect in the natural habitat make for an artificial reef, and that attracts all sorts of fish, shrimp, animal life, fixed plant life that will grow, and, in a way, we're fixing life.
Oyster farming the world over relies largely on just one species, Crassostrea gigas, known as the Pacific oyster. It comes from Japan. Just how and why has this species from the Pacific managed to spread all over the world and replace the European flat oyster? Worldwide exchanges between different zones of oyster farming caused the flat oysters to die out. In the 1970s, a group of French oyster farmers and scientists, on a recent trip to the US, decided to bring home a few oysters. But the oysters were carrying a parasite that nearly wiped out the native oysters along the French coast. At the western tip of Brittany, in the village of Postpoder, this laboratory of the IFREMER, the French Oceanographic Institute, is specialized in invertebrate physiology. Here, a team of scientists is studying Brittany's few remaining wild flat oyster beds, some patches in Brest Harbor and Quiberon Bay that have been spared by the parasites.
Well, this is a good sample.
The scientists take regular samples.
We'll have to sort this out now.
They are hopeful that their work will allow oyster farmers to once again raise flat oysters in a few years. The stakes are economic for the professionals and ecological for the scientists.
The long-term goal is to bring this species back to Brittany. It's a native species, indigenous to Brittany, that was overfished and suffered from pollution, a species that is dying out. And our job is to try to bring it back in the coming years. It's what you call an ecological restoration, the ecology of restoration.
Perhaps someday French scientists will find a strain that can resist the viruses imported by man. To this end, they are selecting and breeding flat oysters from one of Brittany's last natural oyster beds spared by the disease. There are only 3 different species in the world.
There aren't all that many oysters. The first is the Pacific cupped oyster, a species found the world over and farmed on a very large scale. The second species that we've been discussing is much rarer and exists only in Europe. There's a third species, pearl oysters. We're lucky, in French Polynesia, we have the black-lipped pearl oyster. It's an animal that works for the jewelry business. The other oysters are more for aquaculture and the food industry.
In the Buccaneer Islands off the northwest coast of Australia, oyster farming is quite different than in France. 800 islands strung along 1,000 kilometers of coast, scorched by the sun and lapped by the Timor Sea. Hardly any humans apart from a few scattered Aborigine communities. The odd adventure and a treasure, the white pearl. The pearl oyster of the South Seas produces an extremely lustrous nacre.
Our fishing season starts around April and runs for anywhere up to 2.5 to 3 months. We take a team of divers up to 48. Parlier will take down the coast on up to half a dozen different motherships. We tow the divers, we call them drift divers. Drift diving, we tow them along the bottom where their sole purpose of being down there is picking up the shell, the wild shell. And during the day, the divers will spend up to 8 hours a day underwater, using our devised tables to ensure that we have no decompression illness.
First, the divers gather oysters from the open sea. They will be used to produce cultured pearls. Up above on the lab boat, the technicians implant a small shell seed in the shellfish. For several years, the oyster will secrete nacre around this little nucleus. After the graft, the oysters are placed in metal racks and put back into the water. This system reduces the losses due to the underwater currents and offers a resistance to the wind. The pearl oysters will spend 2 years in the sea, the time it takes to produce a lovely layer of nacre.
We describe it as being underwater labourer. The work itself is strenuous. It's like pushing a wheelbarrow underwater. Imagine that. We're in 20 metres of water most of the time, which is 3 atmospheres of pressure. So you've got those extra pressures on your body while you're working. You're lifting and carrying things unnatural ways. Yeah, you do get worn out quite quick.
Just like the oysters destined for our tables, pearl oysters need a lot of hands-on work. They have to be regularly turned over, moved, and cleaned of their algae. It's an exhausting job for the crew. This protected zone off the northwest coast of Australia is one of the world's major pearl producers. Pearl collection and production began in this country in 1861, following the discovery of a major oyster bed. Australia's first pearl farm was founded 100 years later.
This shell now is probably 7 years old. It was 3 to 5 when it was fished on the 80-mile beach. There's another 2 years grow out. And it's been cleaned more than 50 times in that 2-year period, carefully by our farm workers. And it was delivered to the ship last night, opened this morning, and there we have a beautiful pearl. Let's go upstairs and see what's come out of the harvest today.
White or golden, one of the characteristics of these pearls is their large size. It's not unusual for the pearls here to reach 2 centimeters in diameter. In Brittany, in the port of Trinité-sur-Mer, the oyster farmers are waiting for sunrise to head out to their concessions, a zone in the middle of the Quiberon Bay. The crew is going out to harvest oysters raised in the open sea. It's a very old technique of oyster farming. The oysters are scattered on the sandy bottom about 10 meters down. They grow without any human intervention.
So we're getting ready to start work. So we are approaching the oyster bed. We'll be able to drop the dredges to collect the oysters.
Halfway between farming and fishing, they use dredges, an oyster fishing technique handed down through the generations.
We're rocking. I'm going to place the boat stern to wind to stabilize her. We've filled 8 containers in 2 sweeps, so 2 containers make around 300 kilos, so 600 kilos per sweep. It adds up quickly.
C'est bon là?
It's a lot of work. This is just one stage. It took a lot to get where we are. There's more work to be done before they're ready to be sent to our clients.
With nature and the tides calling the rhythm, oyster farming is an exhausting job. The work never stops. All along the French coastline, the stocks of oysters in the oyster farms have increased in value thanks to years of hard work. It's a coveted treasure that needs to be protected. Over the past few years, there's been a rise in oyster thefts from the beds. These thefts concern the large marketable oysters, the most expensive, and they take place at night, under the cover of darkness. It's nearly impossible to keep a watch over all the oyster farms along the coast. These open-air burglaries have become rather commonplace. When the holiday season is near, oysters disappear left and right. 500 kilos here, 2 tons there, sometimes much more. These robberies are often the work of professionals.
There's a year's worth of work out in those oyster beds. If our oysters get stolen, it's all the profits that disappear with them. I had 82 20-kilogram bags of number 2 oysters stolen from me. And another time, 80 bags of the same size.
The mounted forces of the Republican Guard come out every winter to patrol the Normandy beaches. So for several years now, the oysters here have been well guarded. Everyone concerned is trying to come up with an ideal solution to stop these thefts. In the Marennes-Oléron sector, the oyster professionals are also getting organized. As soon as any bags disappear, they immediately send out an alert to all the other oyster farmers.
We get messages from the regional sector, the Ostréiculture Association. We receive messages like this that notify us that our colleagues were hit by thefts.
2 young biological engineers think they may have found the solution oyster farmers have been waiting for. They've invented the connected oyster, an electronic snitch nicknamed the mystery oyster. Plus, it can even collect data on the marine environment.
Here's the latest version of the mystery oyster. Have you seen the prototypes?
No, not at all.
We worked on the encapsulation, we honeycombed the plastic to strengthen it. The principle is quite simple. You place the oysters in the bags, and as soon as the oyster is moved, it'll send a message that you receive on your cell phone.
Okay, as if it were a GPS.
We have relays all along the coast that will localize the bag right down to the row. When you see that every week they're receiving text messages about tons of oysters being stolen, we really needed to come up with something.
All around the island of Oléron in Charente, these geometrical basins are fed by seawater with the tides. These basins are the clairs. They allow the oyster farmers to mature their oysters before putting them on the market. This stage attenuates their salt sea taste. The clairs are one of a kind. They're old salt pans converted into oyster beds in the mid-19th century. This patchwork, straddling land and sea, even gave their name to the oysters of the region, les fines de clairs.
I've come back to check on my oysters, see how they're doing, if they've grown, if they put on weight. These ones are green. You can see they've absorbed an algae that grows in the salt pans. This is characteristic of the Marennes-Oléron region basin. We are lucky to have an oyster that turns green. It's a pleasure for the eyes.
Qui est très, très agréable à regarder.
In the Bellon River in Brittany, south of Finistère, tons of oysters are waiting to be sold in the four corners of France and the rest of the world. Thanks to the rhythm of the tides, the oysters are irrigated and fed by both the salty currents of the Atlantic Ocean and the fresh river water as well. This alternation is essential for the quality of the mollusk. After 3 to 4 years at sea, the maturation in the Bellon River refines the flavor, mellows the flesh, and reduces the salinity. Oysters are very different depending on where they come from. Be it Normandy, Brittany, the Charente, Arcachon, and even the Thau Lagoon in the Mediterranean, oysters embody all the characteristics of the places where they were raised.
Michel, do you have any number 4 specials? Where are they?
Dis-moi laquelle c'est. C'est quoi, c'est gris?
Before being sold, the oysters are washed and sorted by category and size. The spéciales are more fleshy, the top of the line for connoisseurs.
You could have put them over there.
On fait pas aujourd'hui, ici. On va pas en faire aujourd'hui.
Very good. I'm just checking that they're still as fleshy as a few days ago, if the calibration is accurate, if the norms have been respected. There are many categories: fine, spécial, black pearls that get about this big. They're all different.
A group of French oyster farmers export a small part of their harvest to Asia, to China. These professionals are facing a hefty challenge, initiating the Chinese consumers to raw oysters, à la française.
This morning I'm off to see my local partner. I've been with him for 7 years. He's got a delivery of French oysters. They'll be getting about 10 containers that'll go for reshipping straight to all the restaurants of Shanghai and even other Chinese cities.
Shall we have a taste?
Okay, go ahead.
Très bien, on va se mettre ici, peut-être non. Autrement, on va les prendre dans la tête.
World's finest oysters. Cost to quality, they're unbeatable. You know how to open them, or shall I?
I'll leave it to the pro.
With a genuine Chinese knife. You tip out the first water, then you eat it. How's that for breakfast? Couldn't be any fresher. They're from Carantec. All the oysters from Carantec are like this.
Now in the big cities like Beijing and Shanghai, people are beginning to consume oysters a bit. But China's so vast. We Chinese are very open to products like this, imported products. The population here is 1,200,000,000.
A lot of people.
If each person were to consume one oyster, it starts to add up. We'd empty out the sea in Brittany.
The sea in Brittany won't be emptied out. And French oyster farmers are not about to conquer the entire market. They're simply targeting the upmarket clientele. Oysters have always been part of the Chinese gastronomical tradition. The country is the world's leading oyster producer, with 80% of the total output, ahead of South Korea and Japan.
Taste them if you like. I'm not going to try them.
No.
Okay.
Yeah?
The French oyster, eaten raw, is an in food at Shanghai's trendy restaurants. The head seafood waiter of the Mercado has a menu offering oysters from France, but also from Canada and even from Africa, from Namibia. It's the latest fashion.
You see, the French oyster, it looks very, very nice. Also, you can smell it from the sea. So the French oyster is very fresh. It's very fresh. Just open it, you can taste it from the sea. That's all. Fresh.
They eat French oysters here like we do in Europe. They open them and eat them raw or with seasoning or prepared by the chef, like in France. They eat Chinese oysters in soup, from jars, already cooked, but never raw. It's too dangerous.
Chinese sea, this area, the sea water is not clean, so we cannot eat Chinese oyster is raw. So we import the French oyster is a good quality and the taste is very good.
French oysters were a staple on the tables of the Roman aristocrats. Now, 2,000 years later, they continue to appeal to gourmets. They're no longer transported in carts, but travel the world by jet plane. In China, the oyster has become a symbol of the French art of living and gastronomy, on a par with foie gras and champagne.
If you want to eat oysters Chinese style, you have to poach them in soup. We put a lot of different ingredients into the soup to give it a special taste.
Let me see.
Would you like to taste?
It looks good. The texture stayed the same? It's really good.
%70 of France's oyster harvest is sold during the holiday season. Christmas is just a few days away. All along the French coastline, the oyster farmers are putting in endless days of work. They're gearing up for the most intense period of the year.
Why are oysters sold by the dozen, as well as eggs and bottles and a number of other products? Well, a long time ago, people didn't know how to count or write, or rather, they could just about count. They didn't have paper or pencil. They used the phalanges of their fingers on a base 12, like this. They would count like this, 1, 2, 3, 6, and so on. This allowed people to do business and trade without needing to write. They would understand each other. It's like that with eggs, wine, and, of course, oysters. This is the big week when we crate the oysters. 3 days until Christmas Eve. We put in really long hours. It's a grind, but it won't last. Another 2 or 3 days of this, then we get a few days breather. Then it'll be back to work for New Year's Eve.
Pour le premier de l'an, voilà.
Ah là là. Encore une palette là qui reste? C'est la dernière?
With the holiday season approaching, millions of oysters are being harvested from the ocean. In France, close to 50,000 tons will be sold and consumed over Christmas and New Year's.
Et le 4, 40 par 18.
So that's 3 number 3s, 3 number 2s, 3 number 4s, and 16 number 3s. This is the season. And there's next week. Then things will calm down. But it's now or never. These are the final days of the rush. We started early this morning, and we're still at it, because in an hour we'll be going back down to the sea. We've still got a lot to do. Our day is not done. What did you load up, Stéphane? Did you put the 16 pallets of number 3s in front?
Là, tu mets tout le 3, les 16.
These Normandy oysters will be shipped all over France. Most of them will go to the big retail outlets. With Christmas just around the corner, the oyster, which symbolizes festivity and warm family get-togethers, is the queen of the French markets.
It takes a lot of work to produce just one oyster. It takes between 3 to 4 years. We haul them from one place to another to get them to grow, so they'll be in top condition. They'll go to Brittany, and then they come back here. We've been constantly handling them right up till today, and this will be the last time. Thank you very much. Happy holidays.
Oyster farming is a unique profession. From spat to crating, the oyster farmer has to be in control of every stage of production. One and the same person is the raiser, the one who sows and harvests, the agent and the seller. Scientists are still trying to pierce the mysteries of the oyster. Today, this surprising filter mollusk is helping researchers study the evolution of the climates and the acidity of the oceans. The oyster is a sentinel of the quality of the environment where it feeds.
This animal may not be very attractive. It's not a dolphin, not a bear. People may not feel an attachment to the species. But in the end, this insignificant little animal incarnates all the force of humanity, along with all its follies. And I think, as we're now trying to restore nature, maybe the oyster also tells of a better future where we will bring back this species to rectify the errors we've committed.
At the Carré des Feuillants, the chef is putting the finishing touches on his signature dish, the Arcachon Special, ébène caviar with oyster leaves. Here in the heart of Paris, the tangy sea savors of shellfish are heightened by passion and refined with art.
I have a small vineyard. In fact, it's a garden. I inherited it from my parents. I kept a parcel of it. I promised them I'd keep on making my own wine as long as I lived, and it's my garden. In that vineyard, I also have a rosebush at the end of each row. As soon as the rosebush starts to have problems, I know that the grapevines are coming down with some kind of disease, that they'll be catching mildew or something else. That gives us the alert. You get the alerts right away with oysters. They are a bit like roses in a garden. The roses get attacked first before the potatoes. This animal has been living for thousands of years in a very simple and a very favorable ecosystem. So let us try to respect it. We don't have the right to destroy oysters, and bees for that matter. The sea is a garden.
The oyster is a treasure of nature. Between land and sea, this mysterious creature is an early warning system for the health of our planet.